Thank you, everybody, for once again tuning in to the Don't Worry Nobody's Listening podcast. As always, I will be your host, Jason Minicky Critchlow. You can subscribe to my Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, and YouTube channel at JSONBANICKI. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play Music, Amazon, Castbox, Satchel, Podbean, YouTube, as I aforementioned, just amongst some of the Spotify, which I forgot to mention at the end of this episode. But this week is a solo episode, so you just get to listen to me kind of rant and rave and wander all over the place. But I take on three main topics. I guess four technically, but we'll go with four main topics. One of the first thing I talk about is just kind of seeing through the bullshit that is the Uber commercials from their CEO talking about how they've changed and they're trying to be better. He's been there almost a year and nothing's changed. They're the same garbage company they were before, still trying to exploit, the drivers in the most inhumane ways possible, essentially, where they forced out cabs that actually used to pay decent wages in so many cities, and basically have people that were once cab drivers or people that are just between jobs or that scraping to get by on wages that essentially and most of the time doesn't equate to minimum wage, let alone near enough to live in a major metropolitan city. I go from there, and then I talk about LeBron's new charter school academy in Akron. And, again, kind of just talk about how great I think things like that are, giving back by an athlete and how more athletes should be doing things like that. Then I go from there and I talk about the new Trayvon Martin Docuseries, Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story. I got a feeling that I don't know, like I said, at the end of this episode, I don't know my audience well enough to know if it'll split it or not. But hopefully as you hear some of my views, some of you will hit me up on Twitter and the Facebook page and give me some of your thoughts on that. Love to have a larger discussion on that. And then I finish by talking about kind of my takeaways from the Demi Lovato overdose situation last week and kind of what that can tell us more about our society at large. I think, we got to look at the way we treat our white celebrities versus everybody else, and particularly when it comes to drug addiction. And with that, I will let the intro take us away.
That's all. We got one goddamn hit.
You can't say goddamn on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
'Cause I cannot change. I will not evolve. I am an artifact of the last of my kind. You will encounter me in the pages of a textbook. Too scared to move ahead, so stubborn I was left behind. My tiny brain buried in my thick skull. I'm the last of my kind.
And take three. Not that you guys know that because you'll never hear takes one or two, but this has been off to a rocky start this week, and unfortunately for you, or fortunately for you, depending on how much of my wisdom that emanates off the top of my head and through my mouth into your speakers, you enjoy. This is going to be just a me, myself, and I podcast, unless any of the people I reached out today somehow call me during the middle of this. So we're kind of set up to take the phone calls if they do call in. If they don't, then it's just me, myself, and I, and that's going to be what you get. So anyways, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because like I said, I want to avoid being always sports every week, even though that's been pretty much all it's been the last 4 or 5 podcasts. I want to try and avoid that. And I also wanted to get one out this week because if I don't today, then I'm probably looking at, another week before I can get one out with my work schedule and things like that. So I wanted to try and get this recorded and out to you today. And one of the things I will want to talk about later will tertiarily touch on sports because I don't want to leave out a big happening today in the sports world, but it's not exactly about sports. So I'm not going to get into that first. One of the first things I want to get into is one of the things I've been hearing the most about on like Instagram or Facebook. I'm sure there's probably been plenty of TV commercials because that's what it started out as. I just don't watch terrestrial TV, so I don't get a lot of commercials in the way I stream. But anyways, you've seen now the new Uber CEO out there. You know, for the last 9 months since I've taken over, we've been trying to work to change the company and make things better for the drivers and the passengers and the people who work for Uber. I'm going to say this as somebody who's a passenger, who's been a driver both of the last summers while I was between jobs. Let's thank God that I start back to work next Tuesday with a regular paycheck job, so I don't have to kill myself driving Uber. I can tell you from those two sides, zero's changed. I know they're like, oh my God, you can now send a message to your driver through the app. It's like, great. I could always call them. I could have always messaged them if I really needed to. And like the only time you really need to tell them what you're wearing is if you're somewhere like where you know there's going to be a ton of Ubers trying to pick somebody up at one time. That should have always been an option. And if you as a driver, I can really tell you nothing's changed. So for any of you who are passengers but not drivers, you wouldn't know this. But say on a short trip that's $6 or $7, Uber is taking at least 50% of that. By and large, because depending on where you live, they have a booking fee. It's anywhere from $265 on up that they take 100% of. So the drivers don't even get any portion of that. So if you take short trips, make sure to tip your driver well, because they're making $0 doing that trip. They have lost money taking you on a short trip, because Uber's goal is to get you so dependent on it that you eventually decide to give up your cars, and then they can jack the prices up. But what we've seen is in a summer like this where the gas prices are much higher than last summer when I drove, is that Uber's basically resistant, and Lyft too. But Uber's the one that's on the big marketing campaign right now to say how different we are and how focused we are on mending relationships with our drivers and our passengers. And we know we've made mistakes, but we're going to be different now because we got a new CEO. Guess what? They're not. They're not any different. They're still just trying to get you locked into their ecosystem. They're still trying to pay drivers as humanly little as possible and make sure that they just make just enough to subsist and stay on the system just a little bit longer. Hopefully roping them in. Luckily, I think Uber might have come to a conclusion that it might be time to focus back on their drivers this week, since they did shut down their driverless car program and their driverless truck program, realizing that that's probably farther away than, anybody realizes from being able to be on the roads. Because not that the technology is bad or flawed or anything like that, but because you're going to run into a situation where the infrastructure is not there, where there's too many people driving that are still going to make errors. And then when self-driving cars involved in that crash, people look to blame the technology as opposed to themselves. So you always see the ad, the news when a self-driving car is involved in an accident. You don't even know if it's at fault most of the time. You just hear that it was involved. Just like anything else, there are certain things that are unavoidable. Once another person makes such a critical error, you can't correct for it. That's why I like the word crashes as opposed to accidents. Accidents imply that it just happened. It couldn't have been prevented. Crashes indicate that something clearly could have been prevented if people would have been doing the right thing, which is why I think eventually we'll get to self-driving cars and they'll lower crash numbers, because, you're not going to, self-driving cars aren't going to try and run a red light to make up time. They're not going to be speeding crazy to try and make up time. They're not going to make any of the million critical errors that people make on a day. It's just turned yellow, I'll make it through plenty, or anything like that. They're not going to make those mistakes. But what I'm saying is, back to my key point is, with gas prices exploding this summer, they never once thought to raise the rate of the mileage rate charged to customers, because they were afraid they might lose some rides. And I know they have metrics and all these things that say, well, if we go up this much, we'll lose this many rides, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Analytics, though, can be done to death. They really can. So when I was driving last summer here in South Bend, where I live, the mileage rate was like 85 cents a mile. They've offered now at Uber, it was a test market, and then last year they added this optional driver insurance an injury program, like basically saying if you get injured on the job, you'll compensated for missed time and things like this at a cost of 4.5 cents a mile. Well, then they raised the rate 6 cents a mile to 91 cents because, of course, Uber's still taking their 25% out of that. Now, granted, for somebody like me who's not going to opt into that, then that's fine. You know, I'm making 4.5 cents more a mile. But again, this is kind of what you deal with. Oh, we're going to give you an optional insurance part, but we're still taking our 25% cut out of the mileage increase to help you pay for it. But guess what we saw? In some of this is Uber and Lyft being here in South Bend longer. But guess what? 6 cents went up last summer. Was much slower to me as a driver than this summer has been. So I've seen an increased demand that indicates that if they would have increased mileage 10%. So let's say we go to a flat $1 a mile. Your average driver is going to make 75 cents as opposed to, you know, let's say 6.5. So, you know, 68.5 cents a mile. Doesn't seem like a lot. But again, over 30 miles. So let's even go over 20. You know, that's an extra $1.30 over an average gallon of gas. You know, that would have paid for the gas increase. It also allow the driver a little bit more leeway to come closer to being a little more profitable and make a decent wage. Because realistically, they're not set up to make decent wages. Particularly if you're in a lower income area like I am here, everybody forgets that being driven in an Uber and a Lyft is a service. So they don't tip you like they would, you know, a barber or a waiter or a waitress, but somebody gets you from point A to point B safely. They've provided you a service. They shouldn't have to provide bottled water or candy or anything else. I've always tipped every Uber and Lyft driver I've had, every delivery driver I've had, you know, any cab driver I've had. That's just part of the social contract. You were provided a service. You tip above and beyond just the rate you're charged. But the problem with that is, this is a lower socioeconomic city, so the demographics are real bad. So people are just trying to skate by on the minimum. B, Uber started out so badly with such a negative connotation to tipping, and it was partly because they didn't want to include a tip option in the app, and then it's also because they didn't want to include an option to say, you know, this is they tried to pretend that the tip was included, and then they kept dropping the rate. It's like it's not anymore. You've got to make sure that people understand better. And again, they made a big push to say tipping was in the app, but they've never made a push to change the mentality amongst their passengers. Say, look, you know, your driver provided you a great service, and here's how, you know, an opportunity for you to award them for their effort, given that they're providing you a safe ride at a relatively low cost. So, you know, it would be appreciated if you would tip them for their service to you, because that's the way it should be. Again, I tip a barber on a service they provide, even though they make typically above the minimum wage. You know, we should be tipping servers even if they make the minimum wage, which they should, and that's a whole nother discussion. But Uber, to its core as a company, doesn't want to encourage people to spend money outside of their things, and that's before we even get into things like driver rankings, which they've done both sides, Uber and Lyft, are trying to do better at keeping people, creating a system where it says, well, if you rank somebody 4 stars or low, you should put a reason why you rank them lower. For Uber, you have to. For Lyft, they recommend it. But they've still never explained to passengers what they really should be rating somebody 5 for, somebody 4 for, 3, 4, 2, 1, etc. So I'm going to do my best to explain it to any of you who are listening who may take services like this and then rate drivers when you get off who don't happen to be drivers. Because as a driver, you understand your expectation is to be at a 4.8 rating or higher. If you drop before 4.6 or lower, that you could be suspended. And then, of course, obviously, everybody wants to be as close as 5 as they can. But realistically, if somebody picks you up on time, takes you either the route that's on the GPS that they're using or the route you tell them to, and get you there with 0 incident, that's a 5-star ride. Period. End of discussion. The only time you should be rating, and you should never use 4. I will tell you that now. There is 0 excuse to use 4-star rating ever. Because if you're going to rate somebody down 4, you should go 3 or lower. Because, and I would say stop at 3 unless it's a really atrocious ride, then give them a 1. But it's kind of the same philosophy I use with passengers. You're either a 5 or a 3 or a 1. I just throw out the 2s and the 4s because there's zero reason to even have those there. It's one of the things I like about the Uber Eats system where it's just thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up, thumbs down. Now, again, I wish they would make everybody rate everybody. Every ride you take, every ride you give, you should have to give out ratings. And they're both getting away from that. And it's just bad. It's bad for the whole ecosystem because you can't tell who good drivers are, who bad drivers are. But here's a 5-star ride, like I said. Pick you up, get you to where you're going in a timely fashion using, like I said, either the route that you give them or the route on the GPS, and they have no major incidences. But between point A, point B. 3 stars would be for something like a dirty car. They expected you to walk to meet them to pick up when it's not a major event. If it's a major event, you should be expecting to meet the driver some halfway point or somewhere where they can get, because there gets to be points where a major event, you can't get to them. And, we'll get into driver or passenger etiquette here in a little bit, things that can help, improve the system on things that Uber and Lyft should be required to do. But, they require you to come to them when they've missed you or aren't quite in the right spot. Those would be the 2 bigs that I would say deserve a 3-star. A small safety issue when or take a long route, I would say. Say they intentionally skip whatever the navigation is, unless they can explain it to you, because there's times where I'm taking passengers and I can see like it's trying to make me zigzag through things, and I just simply tell the passenger, it's no longer if I just go up here and make one turn as opposed to make a right, then make a left, then make another right. It's like, I don't understand why, Google Maps does that, which is what both of the built-in systems use now. People will talk about Waze for days, but Waze is owned by Google Maps now. It's not much better. Apple Maps is horrendous. Let's not even get started there. But again, 3 stars would be dirty car, making you walk to a pickup or drop off if they drop you off pretty far. Again, there are certain times where you can only get so close. And everybody should be understanding of that. And then, like I said, improper navigation. And then 1 stars I say for probably the most extreme situations. I've had people when I was a passenger pick me up, but not pick me up. Of course, if that gets 1 star, then I send my message like, hey, this has never happened. As you can see, I'm currently requesting a ride at that same location. So clearly they didn't pick me up. Why they marked me as picked up and then took off and kept the meter running, I don't know. You need to figure that out. And of course I got refunded, but still that deserves a 1 star. Running a red light, speeding excessively, driving erratically, having another person in the car should be an automatic 1 star. Being in the wrong car when they come to pick you up. Those would be the things that you save 1 stars for. Other than that, there should that covers most scenarios. There obviously be certain safety issues. The driver's violent or tries to be grabby or things like that. Obvious 1-star scenarios, and I shouldn't even have to put that out there. But the thing I would like to see as a driver that Uber and Lyft both need to change, if you've used either one, most of the time you just set your PIN for a pickup. End that. Because if it's anywhere, like if it's a shopping mall or an apartment complex or anything where there's multiple buildings, it even happens on residential blocks where GPS is not accurate enough for the PIN placement to tell you where you're actually at. And so they should force you to type in an address. And if it's a place like, an apartment complex, leave a space to put in the building number or building letter, whatever it may be. So it makes it easier for drivers to find you. Because I hate to tell you, in most of your apartment complexes, putting in just an address gets us to the front of the apartment complex, and that's it. And if you don't have a live location on with Uber, or like Lyft, where they actually have the little person, live location option, it gets to be really hard to find you. Same thing with shopping centers. A lot of time it'll pick one spot in the shopping center, and then people get upset when you're there exactly where the pin drops me at as a driver, but it's nowhere near where you're at. And then I message you like, hey, where you at? Oh, I'm all the way. Like, you're the one who used the pin, not me. Like, it'd be very easy to type in Kroger's on da-da-da-da street, and it'll put me at that Kroger's as opposed to 3316 da-da-da-da street, and it just puts me in the shopping center somewhere. Because when there's 5 or 6 or 8 shops on a strip mall, it's going to pick one, even though the whole strip mall could have the same address. So I would say that's kind of the big things that I'd like to see as a driver. And again, like I said, don't buy the marketing hoopla from Uber. They're not any better than they were a year ago or 2 years ago. They're still just a greedy company wasting billions of dollars. I haven't checked their most recent earnings, but, a year ago they were still over a couple $1 billion in losses for the year. But they're doing it because they're poorly managed. They're overly structured at the top. They're overly hired too many computer engineers, and they're trying to over algorithm and over expand without paying the drivers who actually make the company go. I hate to tell this to anybody with Uber, or there's nobody in your C-suite that can improve your company enough to make you profitable. You have to find a way to convince passengers that your service is worth a higher cost. And the only way you're going to do that is if you have happier drivers. And right now what you're doing, where you flood markets with too many drivers and basically make drivers compete against drivers, and where you don't raise the mileage rate when the gas prices go up significantly, and you don't make it easy for pickups and drop-offs by allowing the misuse of GPS pins, you're just not going to create a winning experience for drivers, which is not going to necessarily create a winning experience for passengers. And then you're just not going to create increased demand for your product enough to raise your rates to where you can actually be profitable. Because here's the thing. Despite the common myth, Uber has done almost zero to disrupt the transportation industry. Like, they've forced cabs out of business, but they've just replaced them with people's personal vehicles. They haven't done anything to change the price point of getting somebody from point A to point B, other than they're basically making people work for sub-minimum wage to do that. And in a lot of cases, if you look at taxes, for the 2 years I've done it so far, I've technically lost money driving each year. So that's kind of the problem there. And if something's not changed soon, I see there being a point where investors stop and just throwing billions and billions of dollars at these companies to say, oh, well, eventually you'll get it right? It's not going to keep happening. They can, the concept of being a unicorn company in IT world is going to eventually stop being impressive. And this concept of, well, it has to work because it's, Silicon Valley. No, we've went through a tech bubble before. We probably headed towards another tech bubble again, with all these companies getting a lot of angel investor money, and then a lot of second round investing money, and a lot of third round investing money for companies that are essentially going nowhere towards profitability anytime soon. Well, maybe if we play the long game, or we'll invest in Lime bikes and Lime scooters because that might help, but then you're creating competition for yourself. When Uber invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Lime scooters, it's like, now you're giving people electronic scooters as an alternative to taking Uber rides. So now, again, you're creating a scenario where you're punishing your drivers and hoarding your core business. Doesn't make sense. So when you see those commercials like it's a new day, we're a new Uber, it's all BS, and it's bad for you, in the words of George Carlin. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about today, and I have no clue how long this episode is going to go because, like I said, it's just me, myself, and I. And it's just going to be only a few things that I really found super interesting to talk about leading up to this week without dipping into the world of sports. And like I said, there's one, and I'm going to talk about it now, that touches on sports, but it's not exactly sports. I mean, it's technically no way, shape, or form sports, but it touches on sports. And that's the opening of LeBron's I Promise School in Akron, Ohio. If you follow the Facebook page, you'll have seen I posted the picture of what the school offers, which is free tuition to all its students, free uniforms for all its students, a free bicycle and helmet for all its students, free transportation to and from school within 2 miles, free breakfast, lunch, and snacks, a food pantry for families, the opportunity to earn GEDs and job placement services for parents, and guaranteed tuition to University of Akron for every student who graduates. Which, again, you see tuition and you think, well, books and room and board. Well, these kids are from Akron, so they wouldn't necessarily need room and board. And I'm sure at some point somebody will help cover the books. If not, I'm sure, there's books. If that's all you got to pay to go to college, I think you've done all right. And again, I'm not a big fan of LeBron's. I don't think he belongs to the GOAT discussion. And I think, I didn't read the article, but there was a thing on Bleacher Report where Wilt Chamberlain said, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said you can't really have a GOAT discussion. And I've had my opinion on that on this podcast, that you really can't, because you're comparing things. And I hate the team hopping, and I hate his constant crybabying. And like, one of the things he was talking about this week is, I went to the Lakers because I want to help a team that hasn't won a championship in a while. They won one in 2010. Get out of here. You want to go somewhere that hasn't won a championship? Well, I go to Philadelphia. They haven't won one going back to the 70s, early 80s, maybe. Maybe it was the last time. I'm not going to look it up. I ain't fact checking myself. Again, that one's been a while. You could go to a place like Houston that hasn't won one since the 90s. Could go to the Bulls that hasn't won one since the 90s. There are teams out there that have never won one that you could have went to. So, I don't buy that. Like, don't give me weak sauce. But it's hard to hate what LeBron has done off the court over his career. Some of it has been followed the Michael Jordan marketing playbook early in his career, but then later in his career, he has not been afraid to speak his mind politically. And for those who tell him to shut up and drill, guess what, Laura Ingram? He's just done more for for his hometown than you ever will. And I wish more athletes would follow his lead when it comes to this. If they want to follow his lead on the floor and go chase super teams and try to find the easiest rings, whatever. I'm not a fan of it, but if they're going to do it, follow his lead off the court too. There are plenty of other guys making hundreds of millions of dollars now who could literally transform their communities like this. And again, this isn't going to hit every student or every person in Akron, but this offers a holistic solution to changing a community little by little. And again, if it works well, then it's one of those things I'm sure he can fundraise and take even farther, have a second one, have middle schools, have elementary schools eventually, create a whole system. But again, you're talking free tuition to essentially a public charter school, free uniforms, free bikes for the kids so they can get themselves back and forth if they don't qualify for the free transport, or if they need to part-time work, they can go to that. Free breakfast, lunch, and snacks. And Akron is, I'm sure, very similar to South Bend, my hometown. It's an old factory town in the Rust Belt that's fallen on hard times, and incomes have fallen. South Bend was borderlining on the South Bend Community School Corporation, and I'd have to look it up, borderlining on having so many kids on free or reduced school lunch that they almost qualified for every student to be on free lunch, because there's a federal tipping point. When you hit so many, it actually becomes more expensive to administer the program for, say, 75% of the students and then have 25% pay, because you just hit a tipping point where the federal government just pays for it all and it actually reduces their expenditure. I'm sure Akron's very similar to that. So when you're talking breakfast, lunch, and snack, again, I grew up with kids who literally only meals were at school, and they did get free breakfast and free lunch. But not every kid qualifies for the free breakfast that gets free lunch or can get there on time. Whereas if you're offering a free breakfast, a free lunch, and a free snack, you're making sure those kids eat at least 2-3 times that day. It may not be a full dinner, but at least you're getting them farther along on that path. Again, a food pantry for these families. So again, if you've got kids who are on free lunch and on free breakfast and now have got a snack, hey, I got a food pantry so you can have something to take home for dinner as well. And then offering outreach for the parents to be able to get their GEDs and have job placements. So you're not just helping the students be the next generation, but you're also taking care of that person who's already a rung, behind, step behind, a rung lower on that socioeconomic ladder. Help them try to reach up and aspire to more, and not just say, well, I'm putting everything on my kid, but I'm also going to have, give the parents a chance. Because again, everybody wants to be self-sufficient at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, we talk about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Some of these people don't have boots. He's trying to help give them boots and give them that hand up to be able to pull themselves up. And then when you're offering free tuition to college with what that costs this day and age, enough said. Like anybody has a problem with that, again, they're just focusing on the wrong things. And this isn't a time to have a verdict about the basketball player. This is time to have a verdict about the person. And this easily puts him in the Mount Rushmore of impactful athletes off the court. It's easy to sell sneakers, but if you get caught up in that, well, Republicans buy sneakers too, or Democrats buy sneakers too, depending on whatever your politics are, and then just shut up and dribble, keep your mouth shut, then you don't impact things as well. And, you're seeing a change in that with athletes that are putting their money where their mouth are and say, I can do a lot for my family with my money, but I can do a lot more for my community with either my voice, my money, or both. And I'm glad to see it. It's time for that change. It's time for an end of the I'm not a role model kind of athlete era. You are role models, whether you want to be or not. You might be an unwilling role model, but to so many people who grow up in situations where there's almost zero other hope other than becoming a professional athlete or an entertainer of some sort, you are a role model. And the more you own that and own up to it and build on it and help, again, give that hand up, the more you're going to fulfill on it and give these people some real opportunities. I think that's all I want to say about that. I don't want to belabor that point too much. But again, like I said, it's just nice to see somebody really giving back to their hometown. So he won't be in Cleveland anymore. That's going to impact that economy some. But again, he's a kid from Akron, not a kid from Cleveland. I know people conflate those things when they talk about it, but he's from Akron and he's giving back to Akron, and he's helping his home community out. And there's not a lot of guys who do that. There's a lot of guys who write checks to other organizations to handle things, but he's putting his stamp on it. He's putting a lot of dollars in, not just a check, but a lot of dollars and a lot of face time in to make this successful. And like I said, I hope it takes off, and I hope other people follow suit and do the same thing. Now, one of the other things I want to touch on, and I'm not going to get into it too heavily today, but this is, Tuesday. I think we're on July the 31st now. It is July the 31st. Yesterday, you could have watched. Hopefully that yawn wasn't as heavily on mic as it could have been. On either the Paramount Network or BET, you could have watched the first part of the Trayvon Martin documentary, the Trayvon Martin story, Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story that Jay-Z produced. And again, I'm not going to get into it too heavily, but take some time, carve it out, watch it. And again, it's going to bring up a lot of things for a lot of people on both sides. It was a very divisive story then. It's still part of a very divisive narrative now. And I just want people to think about something long and hard. I'm going to give a few points that I took away from the episode, from the trial, from everything leading up to this. Here's going to be a few things I want you to think about very, very, very hard. I don't want you to look at George Zimmerman as either white or Peruvian. I don't want you to look at Trayvon Martin as black, although it's a large portion of the story for this first part. I just want you to put this story in your mind and apply through the scope of anything else. And take your common sense and say, okay, who was in the right and who was in the wrong? I have a 17-year-old kid wearing a hooded sweatshirt. He's gone from his dad's girlfriend's house to 7-Eleven to get an iced tea and some Skittles. It's about to be the All-Star game. It's 7 p.m. in Florida in February, so it's dark already. It's raining. He throws up his hood because it's raining. And as kids are apt to do when it's raining, he's cutting through homes on his way home. Then a full-grown adult male, armed with a firearm, sees him cutting through homes and calls into 911. Right thing to do, by the way, if you see somebody who's acting suspicious or anything. And I put air quotes around suspicious because, again, it's a kid cutting through yards and through houses during the rain with his hoodie on. All normal things, in my opinion, for people to do. When I was packing up to move from Bloomington, I had to go to Target to get a mop so I could finish cleaning up my apartment. I got caught in the rain and I started hopping into tree lines and under awnings of buildings and houses and anywhere I could keep myself out of the rain. It's a natural, normal thing to do. But, again, cutting through yards. Guy picks up the phone, calls 911. So far, everybody's kind of doing what they should be doing. Then, after saying these assholes always get away, he looks like he's on drugs or something, which I'm not sure how you can tell from that far away. You're riding in a vehicle, but you've made the assertion that he's on drugs. And then after you get out of your vehicle and start following him, and the dispatcher asks you, are you following him? And you mutter under your breath, these fucking punks. And you say, yeah, I'm following him. Dispatcher says, well, we don't need you to do that. Can you go meet up with the officer when he gets there? You still chase this individual down. Let's be crystal clear about it. That's what happened. Trayvon was heading one direction away from where George Zimmerman was at. George Zimmerman was following Trayvon Martin after being told not to. At that point, once you once there's a confrontation, person who disregarded the police, the person who followed the other person, is responsible for the rest of the altercation. If I'm being followed by somebody who has no other reason to follow me, I'm going to be a little hostile too. And again, we've never got to hear Trayvon Martin's story because that kid got shot straight in the heart. End of discussion. Shot and killed, died instantly. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That kid was dead the minute he got shot. So we've never got to hear his story. We've got to hear George Zimmerman tell his version of events. But here's the things we know. Trayvon Martin was walking home from getting Skittles and iced tea. Had no other weapons on him other than himself. 17 years old, probably about 160 pounds. Being followed by a full-grown adult who weighed probably 240, 250 pounds, armed with a 9mm pistol, who disregarded police orders or dispatch orders, first responder orders, whatever we want to call it. But he disregarded the dispatcher. It kept following him. And a confrontation ensued because George Zimmerman got out of his vehicle, armed with a firearm, and pursued somebody who he deemed to be on drugs, who he automatically assumed these guys always get away because he assumed he was up to no good. And as he said, fucking punks always get away. Who do you think's responsible for what happens from there on out? Once there would have been no confrontation if George Zimmerman would have listened to the motherfucking dispatcher. That's my take on that. If you do what you're told, as we always hear, when an unarmed black guy gets shot by the police, well, if he would have listened to what the cops said, then that wouldn't have happened. Well, if George fucking Zimmerman would have listened to the goddamn dispatcher, that shit, when Trayvon Martin would be alive and well today. End of discussion. This George Zimmerman's broken fucking busted up nose, couple scratches on the back of his head. Again, you stalk me, you follow me, same thing's likely to happen. That's the reality of it. You want to follow me, you want to hunt me down, essentially, because again, you're carrying, and again, he saw his hands in his hoodie because he was, again, carrying an iced tea and a pack of Skittles in there, so he's holding on to him as he's cutting through yards. He doesn't know that he doesn't have a weapon. Again, got out of the vehicle, followed against orders. He owns it. End of discussion, in my opinion, at that. But then I'm going to get into two other things, at least, before I move on. One of the biggest things that prosecutors never pushed at trial, that they didn't hammer home in their closing, and that will bother me until the end of time, about the fact that George Zimmerman got off because at least this part was not hammered home enough. Throughout the iterations and expanding of his story of continually declaimed self-defense over and over and over again by a criminal justice student who is armed with a firearm, who has clearly become a Second Amendment advocate, who probably was already and probably should have never had the right to own a firearm, given the fact that he had already committed aggravated assault against a police officer previously. But that's another story for another time. That was made clear at the trial. That was made clear over and over again that we can't bring up his violent history, but we're allowed to talk about Trayvon Martin's marijuana residue on a bag. And we're also bring up the word that he brought up the fact that he said, "This cracker's following me," and that's supposed to be his racist epithet, which we covered. Oh no, we didn't cover that. I didn't put that episode out. There ain't no good racist words for white people because you're white people. We're white people. We get away with it. Like what? Cracker? Honky? Not really doing much. Hillbilly? You can get into the more specific, like, ethnic ones, but that's a whole nother issue of white racism when you get into that kind of stuff. But if that's the best you got, what never was hammered home enough, I think, is that during different interviews, George Zimmerman tried to claim that he was the one yelling for help. That was one of the largest points that he made his case for his self-defense case. That I was the one yelling for help when I was out there. I was asking for help, 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 help. And you clearly can hear on one of the 911 tapes somebody screaming and what clearly sounded like somebody asking for help. But when George Zimmerman said Trayvon reached for his gun in the dark, in a fairly dark period of night at 7 p.m., which if you see any other videos taken the next subsequent days, 7 p.m., even as it's starting to light up, was still pretty dark in Florida at that point, with a black gun in a black holster all the way back at his waistband, while Trayvon Martin is supposed to be mounted on top of him, shoving him into the ground, pounding his head into the ground so hard that he feels like his head might explode. Hence why he's fearful for his life. He's screaming for help. He said he reached for his gun, shot at Trayvon. At one point he said he was not sure he shot him. But the minute the gunshot goes off, screaming and yelling for help stops instantaneously. Now I ask you, one of the things, as somebody who's worked at the jail and got to work trials at the courthouse because we had to cover those, one of the main things that jurors get to take back with them when they deliberate is their common sense. Every juror, you bring your common sense into that courtroom, and you start with a presumption of innocence, and you get to sort through the evidence. If I'm claiming self-defense, and I'm claiming that I'm the one screaming for help, and I claimed that I wasn't sure if I shot him at first when I shot the gun. Why does the screaming for help stop the instant the gun is fired? Who was likely screaming for help if it stops the instant the gun's fired and one person died instantly? And the other person claims they weren't sure they even shot him. I rest my case if I'm the prosecution. Clearly somebody's not telling the truth here. Because clearly the person who got shot was the person who was screaming for help. That's why it stopped the minute they got shot. The gun went off. It's the only rational explanation. Because again, even if I shot somebody and I wasn't sure it was fatal, I sure as shit would have still been screaming for help in case they kept coming. But the story doesn't add up. And you want to know why the prosecution didn't have enough evidence to go forward with and put on a case that probably would have convicted George Zimmerman? And this is going to kind of be point 3, and I'm kind of going to end my discussion of this here because, again, there's 5 more episodes, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about each and every one because this is one of those few things that burns in me even to this day when they bring it up, because there are so many people that I used to be friends with on Facebook that I completely unfriended for their takes on it because they kept calling Trayvon Martin a thug and da-da-da-da-da. And these were people I worked with at the jail and have gone on to be police officers, and that's another issue. But, you know how these people are, and they're thugs, and they're like nothing about Trayvon Martin that was a thug. You know, he got suspended for 2 weeks for having marijuana residue on a bag. He was a teenager. We all did different things that people didn't like as a teenager. He wouldn't have even been in Sanford, Florida if it wasn't for that 2-week suspension that was way over the top, in my opinion, for marijuana. And it looks even worse now, 7 years later, 8 years later, through the magnascope of where weed legislation is going. But ultimately, where the biggest problem lies and where things still haven't changed. And again, like I said, this will be one of those things I think burns and gnaws at me for the rest of my days, is that the police were so fast to believe George Zimmerman's claim of self-defense from the get-go. From the get-go, they never pressed his story. Not one time. Not one single time did they press him on it. They just walked him, exactly believed his narrative, never once questioned him on how it went, or anything like that. They're like, okay, sounds good. We'll take it. Because again, you can't get the other person's side of the story because they're dead. So you as the police, at that point, have to push. But the police in Sanford, in Florida, never did. You had a police chief immediately saying that basically there's never going to be a charge filed, that he wasn't going to do it. And of course, he ended up resigning within less than a year. But you had so much mishandling of this case from the word go. Again, when he's claiming in an initial interview that he's the one screaming for help, you should have had him back in that next day with that 911 tape. Why does the help screaming for help stop the minute the gun went off? Why? If you're the one screaming for help, I'm saying rationally, if I was the one, but they never pressed him, not once. They gave him a voice stress analysis for a lie detector, which is probably the worst form of lie detector test, although they're all bad. And again, you're talking to a guy who is a criminal justice student, so he knows this. And then asked him 9 questions. 9 total questions. I've taken a polygraph before as part of getting hired on. When I hired on to work for the sheriff's department at the jail, I spent 4 hours doing that. I was only asked a series of somewhere between 5 and 10 questions after some test questions, but I was asked them multiple times. And one of the keys to any good test like that is you have to ask a question that triggers a falsehood, because you have to see what the baselines are. You have to know what it sounds like when they're telling the truth and when they're telling a lie. Problem with voice stress analysis is it's counting on you being stressed out. And if you're being coached to lie, it's hard for you to be stressed out because you know you're lying. They know you're lying. You're not going to get stressed about it. Because again, the whole concept is that it's looking for a stress reaction based on your fight or flight system when you tell a lie versus when you tell the truth. Doesn't work very well. Some people are more naturally anxious. Some people are less. So sometimes some people will be perfect for that type of test. Others will not. But again, they never pushed him on his narrative. They never questioned why he kept pursuing after he was told to stop, why he ever got out of his truck. Never asked him about any of his series of calls as a captain on the neighborhood watch, where he then didn't, continuously called on young black males as suspicious. They never questioned any of this at all. Again, they didn't question how a teenager who weighed 70, 80 pounds less got the jump, got superior position on the ground from a guy who had been trained. This is a guy who it turns out had training before in self-defense tactics and some sort of, hand-to-hand combat training. So much so that one of the guys tried to advertise it on his site during the trial. And, there was just none of this effort to get to the truth. They just wanted to believe a quick, easy narrative that the guy that they, that was alive told them, and that clearly was the truth. This must be how it happened. There's no doubt about it. This is the truth. This is what happened. This is how it had to be. No charges pressed. You can go home at midnight after shooting somebody at 7 p.m. And then, God forbid, they never did enough background work. We didn't find out till after the trial was over at all that he had been in a fight with his wife that day, who then later ends up getting divorced and committing some sort of domestic incident with. May or may not have been domestic violence. It's always hard to tell in those cases. But again, as we've come to learn out through George fucking Zimmerman's history, he's just a garbage human being who clearly was the worst test case in the history of the world for stand your ground. Because in my opinion, if you ever want to look at stand your ground, Trayvon Martin was the one standing his ground. And then what? Because he was able to somehow knock this punk the fuck out with one fucking punch. And then his hand-to-hand combat training didn't work out. And then he became a punk and reached for his gun because he was going to lose in a fight to a 17-year-old who weighed, 80 pounds less than him. He did what every punk with a gun does. And he fucking shot him because he couldn't take getting his ass beat. That's who George Zimmerman is. I don't give a shit about anything else. And I'm sure some of the people who subscribe to me, I've got a lot of new followers this week on the Facebook fan page, may not agree with that, but I'm not playing the middle road in this one. And there's 5 more episodes to come, and you can count on me probably talking about every single episode. And there ain't going to be a single time I have a good word to say about George Zimmerman, the garbage bag human being he is. Sorry. If the police would have pressed any part of his story, it probably all falls apart. But they never once pressed anything about his story. They accepted every word of it did the minimum amount of investigating possible because they all just wanted to go home. Again, they wanted to do a walkthrough at 5 p.m., and we're going to give him a note to miss class because, again, he's more worried about getting to class than the person he killed. And the detective's more worried about getting home on time than doing the walkthrough at 7 p.m. when the incident, on a similar timeline to when the incident happened, which would have been a much better thing because then you could have saw any of the street lights working down this walkway. Does anybody normally have their back patio light on? Was there more lighting than he was claiming? Et cetera, et cetera. You could at least got a feel for the entire environment. But no, detective was too worried about being home on time, so he sets it up for 5 p.m. instead of similar time frame to when it occurred. Like I said, I don't want to go over point by point by point by the episode. But again, anytime a 17-year-old who weighs at least 80 pounds less than the full-grown adult who's carrying a weapon dies, it's the responsibility of the person who weighed more and had the gun. George fucking Zimmerman was just a punk with a gun who was losing a fight and decided to even the score. The only way he knew how. Well, like I said, I probably spent more time on that than I planned on. But I've got one more thing I want to talk about this week. And it's going to be a little bit different. But it's not going to be completely different, per se. The underlying tones will be very similar. but it's going to be a larger in scope kind of issue. And a lot of it's going to center around kind of the public reaction. I wouldn't necessarily all of us are going to have each individually different reactions to, the Demi Lovato overdose incident last week. And of course, already the public narrative of her people trying to spin it. There's definitely some different information going around every which way, and nobody knows what's true. That's the problem. Her people are trying to say it was a meth overdose. Initially, it was reported as a heroin overdose with the Narcan use. But all you had to do was look at Twitter and all the, don't say a bad word about her. She's got a disease. She needs to get help. And I am usually one to agree that addiction is a disease and it is something that people need help for. But what I find disingenuous about most of these people who talk about, say, a Demi Lovato that way, are that they're going to then be the same people who are going to talk about, well, we need to do something about all these junkies down our neighborhood, all these junkies begging for change, or da-da-da-da-da, going to be complaining about the junkies in their neighborhood or the drug addicts in their city. They're not going to treat the common drug addict with the same compassion that they're treating a white celebrity drug addict. What? Because she can sing, we're supposed to give her a free pass? No. She just had a parting of the ways with her life coach, probably because she fell off the wagon. The person who had helped keep her sober-ish, I guess, is becoming the story now. That maybe that sobriety thing was all overstated. We don't know. It's one of those things where it becomes easy to question now. But it's clearly easy to see that maybe she was sober, had this parting of the ways because he was wanting her to get back in some of the programs because she was falling off the wagon and she didn't want to. Dealing with addiction is a very difficult and very tough task. But again, it's not just a celebrity thing that she got treated differently because I'm going to throw out two other names that were treated very, very differently than Demi Lovato with their addictions. And they were both actually pop singers of different accords, depending on how you want to label the one. They could be pop or R&B. But Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown. Trust me, there was no compassion for black crackheads. We heard all the time about their personal failings, and trust me, there was finally sympathy for Whitney Houston when she overdosed and lost her battle. But there's still almost no sympathy in that for Bobby Brown to this day. But again, he's black and from the hood, and again, it's different, and we treat him differently, and we've always treated crack differently because it was a black drug, as opposed to heroin or meth because those are white drugs, or at least drugs that enough white people use that we suddenly now it's not great personal moral failing, but we have to treat it as a disease and an addiction, and treat it holistically. And prison is not the answer. And I agree with all of those sentiments, believe me. But I believed it for crack, and I believe it for marijuana. Let's not even get marijuana conflated into this, because that's a whole nother issue for a whole nother day. But again, I challenge everybody who's out there, pray for Demi Lovato and hope she gets the help she needs and all of this. Look at yourself in the mirror. Did you say the same thing for Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston? I know some of the people are much too young to have lived through that, but did you feel the same way for Pimp C and even say Lil Wayne with their syrup or any of the other drugs that they do? I bet you if you look hard and really evaluate, you're not really that big of a fan of, a holistic treatment program for everybody, and you don't view it as a disease and addiction all the time. But just when it's somebody famous, who's somebody who's white, who's somebody who happens to be pretty easy in the eyes, if I do say so myself, I think that buys a lot more sympathy than is due in a case like that. And again, it just goes to show again how different the opioid crisis is being treated than the crack crisis. With crack, it was easy to say, oh, these people are super predators. They need to be sent to prison for decades and decades. And with heroin, it's like, oh, you know, we learned from the crack thing. We realized that was really bad. But we haven't really gone through and fixed any of those sentences, or not many of them anyways. You know, we're not allowed to sentence crack different than powder cocaine anymore, which always was a clear indication of, well, see, you know, moral failing, drug addiction, even then, but people didn't want to admit it. They always wanted to blame, you know, all the violent crime on the crack because crack pervaded the low-income areas, whereas powder cocaine typically sold in upper-income areas. Even though, again, drug use is very consistent across socioeconomic status, racial status, geographic status. There's no neighborhoods that escape it. And there's sure no sympathy for most poor drug users. But again, with opioids, we've seen just how differently when it affects large swaths of the white community, how it gets treated as opposed to when it affects large swaths of minority communities. And I think we need to do better. And I think, again, yes, we all should hope and want to see Demi Lovato get treatment and hopefully get her life together, because I don't want to see anybody die from a drug overdose. But let's make sure that we're being equally sympathetic and equally offering help and care all the way around. Because this is one of those things I really do believe needs more attention. And hopefully there are people listening who then challenge people in their own community to say, why aren't we offering more treatment options to our, you know, our drug addicts in this city, period? Because if you really look around what's happened with the opioid crisis, everybody's kind of sitting like, well, what should we do? Well, we don't want to arrest anybody. So now you've just got what's happening in my hometown, where you drive down the main road coming into town and you just have people literally laid out on the sidewalk, drooling, knocked out on heroin, which is not good for anybody. And there's no saying that if you offer these people treatment, they would want to get it. But after you offer them treatment, if they've got possession of paraphernalia or drugs, sorry, you lock them up. I'm going to offer you the alternative, but if you're not going to take it, then you need to be off our streets. And again, I am a person who's very different from most. I don't believe that prohibition of any drug is effective. Clearly, it doesn't stop people from using it. All it does is lead to more violent crime, a larger black market, a higher increased need for police, which leads to higher government spending, more need for prison cells. So if you want my overall view on it, I think it's time to legalize every drug. You have to go do them in a clinical setting. You pay taxes. Anybody who's coming should be offered a treatment alternative. But by and large, if you really want violent crime to drop in this country, and the prohibition on drugs, and violent crime is going to drop even more drastically than it already has over the last 20-some years. Because most violent crime ties into it. It won't be the end of it, because there will still be some addicts who are very desperate and will do everything they can to feed their addiction. But making the substance illegal hasn't stopped the addict from doing it now. Why is it going to stop it in the future? It's one of those things where you're going to get some of my libertarian views coming out of me is that just by prohibiting something doesn't make people stop doing it. So why make something illegal that's in the micro sense only harming themselves? I'm not harmed by somebody else doing heroin or smoking crack or smoking meth. I'm just not. On the other hand, if you get these people to where they have to come to a clinic and report, and you can track them, you can find out which children might be neglected and get them help with services sooner from, and separate them from their drug addicted parents. You could offer them parents a way to turn their kids possibly over a safer solution and not make it so embarrassing. Like, look, we're not going to necessarily take your kids from you per se, but until you get help, we're going to offer you can turn them over willingly, and then once you've had help and treatment, we'll make it easier for you to get them back. Things like that. There are all kinds of kinks to be worked out on this. But again, some of what's made it so dangerous for both the users and the law enforcement, particularly when it comes to the opioids, is because it's being sold on the street and typically getting stepped on. Then you have people doing things very dangerous, like adding fentanyl to it to increase the potency. And now you've got something that just airborne can be very deadly mixed in with the drug. And if there's too high of a concentration, now things go very sideways for people who aren't intending to use it, but it can, be absorbed airborne that way. This is what prohibition leads to. It leads to more dangerous drugs for the users. It leads to more violent crime. It leads to increased government spending on both, police to chase down addicts and dealers and then to lock them up. And it offers no viable solution. You're not going to stop the crime associated with the profitability of the drug trade. But again, as we've seen with states that have legalized marijuana, once you get it into a legitimate market, crime goes down surrounding it. And right now, all that happens is the people that were involved in the marijuana trade move to cocaine and heroin and anything else. But again, if you move those things into, again, a non-prohibited status, then you're going to be in a situation where it'll be just fine and it won't be an issue. But that's a bigger issue for a bigger day, and trust me, it's very far from happening in this country. But my whole point at the beginning of this kind of non-tangential but tangential rant is we need to put things through scopes more in a more colorblind way when we look at situations from the outside, and we need to offer our support to everybody across the spectrum, both, again, socioeconomic, racial, geographic, gender-wise. Drugs don't discriminate. And when I see so much compassion offered to a celebrity who has more resources available to him than 99% of the world, and they fail to make the right decisions, it just hammers home that most of us need to be reminded that you need to extend that same compassion to the drug addicts in your hometown. And we need to offer more solutions to everybody. And at some point, end this awful war on drugs. I guess this is going to be the point I hammer home. And that'll be the conclusion of this episode. I don't know quite where I'm at. I'm guessing somewhere right around an hour. But thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Don't Worry, Nobody's Listening. And there's parts of me that I hope you skip ahead sometimes, because I go when I'm by myself, I get very off on non-tangential rants. And I get lost in my own headspace, but I try to bring it back. I really do. But thank you again for tuning in and listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review, and share with your friends. It's on iTunes, Google Play Music, the Google Podcast app, if that's out, is supposed to be auto-formatted for YouTube, Castbox, Satchel, Amazon, Podbean. Be on the Facebook page, Don't Worry, Nobody's Listening podcast. YouTube is the same as my Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter, which is JASONBANICKI. Like I said, add me on it. Make this a conversation. It's, like the Facebook page. We can all have conversations on there over topics on every episode. This one's going to offer, a few issues that might divide some people on the audience. I don't, have a feel for my audience yet as to who it is. It's, bigger and bigger every episode, but hard to fill out who it is. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and peace out.
'Cause I cannot change, I will not evolve. I am an artifact of the last of my kind. You will encounter me in the pages of a textbook. Too scared to move ahead, so stubborn I was left behind. My tiny brain buried in my thick skull. I'm the last of my kind.
That's all. We got one goddamn hit.
You can't say goddamn on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.